Lecky. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keith Nachman, and I'm an associate professor of environmental health and engineering at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our focus for this session is disaster risk characterization and what it can and cannot accomplish, and identifying challenges and opportunities for communicating risk in the context of similar disasters. We have an absolutely dynamite panel of people, a very large panel of people actually, today that are going to speak with you. I'm going to give the first short talk, and I'll be followed by Dr. Weishui Chu, who is a professor of veterinary physiology and pharmacology at Texas A&M University. Then we'll have Sue Fenton, who's a reproductive endocrinologist and serves as the director of NC State University's Center for Human Health and the Environment. So I just want to start by saying that this morning's session was sobering. And I am deeply grateful for the perspectives of the members of the community and the first responders and healthcare providers who spoke to give their perspectives today. They're invaluable. And I really think that there's something that all of us should hear, and it should be an important part of our consideration as we do the work that we do. And for me, it was really a reminder of why we're doing this, why we're in public health. So thank you so much for giving us your time today. And lastly, but certainly not the least important, is we want to develop and implement a communication strategy. And rule number one in risk communication is a good risk communication strategy will not always smooth the implementation of our risk management strategy, but a bad risk communication strategy will always make things much worse. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. So I wanted to take a moment and address the complexity in this whole risk assessment process, especially in the context of disasters. Some of these are specific to disasters, others are more broadly in our field. The first one, which I think is really important in this particular case, is that our approach to risk assessment was developed around a single chemical exposure at a time, and that's not our reality. We know that even outside of the context of a disaster, we can be exposed to many chemicals all at the same time. And not only that, there are other stressors in our lives, other things like illnesses, stress, food insecurity, and the list goes on and on of other things that can make a person more vulnerable to a chemical exposure. And ideally, we'd have data to take account for all of those things in our estimation of risk. But in reality, one of the challenges is that we rarely have the data to do that quantitatively. And we need to think about other approaches to acknowledge the fact that we have these complex chemical mixtures. We don't really understand how every pair of chemicals acts when they're together. When you have 45 chemicals, it's even more tricky. But there might be other risk management strategies that we can pursue to acknowledge that complex chemical mixtures have the potential to act together to exacerbate illness at a greater rate than individual chemicals by themselves. And if we have other non-chemical stressors, those may further render populations vulnerable to those chemical exposures. So even if we can't put a number on it, we can have that in mind as we plan our risk management strategies. One of the perpetual problems with risk assessment is data gaps. And I think this is a case example of many data gaps. Some chemicals like vinyl chloride, we have a great understanding of the health effects from vinyl chloride exposure. But mix in some of the other acrylates that are far less characterized scientifically, it's difficult to know exactly what they mean for exposure and risk. So how do we deal with that uncertainty when we plan our risk management strategy? That's a really important consideration. Another key example is we got to act fast. Waiting a day or a week may have significant implications for mitigating people's exposures. This is different from, setting a federal regulatory standard where we can take a week or a month to get the numbers right because of the broad societal implications. This has a very focused application to a community in crisis, and we got to go as quickly as possible and work in light of those uncertainties that we have, and that is certainly a challenge. And when those uncertainties are present, it makes communication even more difficult. But communicating among stakeholders is absolutely essential, but it's tough.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about how partially our experience in trying to help bridge sort of the gap in terms of characterizing risk between the measurements and concentrations that were reported both by EPA as well as some of the work that we had done with our partners at Carnegie Mellon, and the challenges in communicating that in sort of this public arena. So next slide. So I often turn to this concept from Donald that was popularized by Donald Rumsfeld during the beginning of the Iraq War, and that there in any disaster there are really three types of information. There are known knowns, meaning things that we already know. There are known unknowns, that things that we know that we don't know. But then there are also unknown unknowns, sort of things that we don't really have a good grasp on.
We have 5 panelists, so we have a little bit less time for questions, but there's some really important questions in the chat that I want to make sure we have time for. So I'm going to start and suggest my co-panelists for responses, and then we can open it up. So we've gotten a series of questions about dioxins. One questioner says that dioxins should have been evaluated as a high priority threat. Another says, when it comes to unknown unknowns like Dr. Chu talked about, what about how dioxins may be combining with other chemicals vis-a-vis synergistic toxicity? So I'd like to invite either Dr. Fenton or Dr. Chu to respond to those questions.
What if I start, Wei Shui, and then you can join in? We did actually conduct a review on the dioxins. The problem with dioxins is that they are a mixture. There's not really going to be one dioxin. There's going to be many. That makes it really complicated. And because we were looking for authoritative sources, it is really hard for us to narrow that down. So just for example, we looked for dioxins and dioxin-like compounds within the last 5 years, and we found 61 systematic reviews or meta-analyses. So this is a lot of information. We haven't combed through all of it yet, but we also wanted to try to focus in on the things that we could actually align with outcomes. And it's really difficult to do that for dioxins. But that, I mean, what I told you, an N of 61, there's clearly health outcomes associated with dioxins. So you have a right to be concerned.
We also have to be cognizant of the fact that when you have mixtures of chemicals that act together, when we base our reference concentrations or MRLs on the most sensitive endpoint, we may neglect the fact that at higher doses, those same chemicals may act to cause other health endpoints. And when we have mixtures of lots of chemicals together, we should probably keep an eye on some of those other organ systems that could be jointly affected by multiple chemicals at the same time. So it's a lot to juggle, but it is certainly important that we keep our reference values up to date with the latest science. Okay, we have a number of questions about cumulative risk, and I feel like it's worth addressing those. So I'll read a couple. Has the chemical reactions of each of these compounds in combination been investigated? What if complex combustion products act as sensitizers? In that case, NOELs may no longer apply. And what, if anything, can we say about the threat of exposure to multiple chemicals at once? I understand there are challenges with mixed chemical studies, but how big of a gap does that create in our understanding of the totality of the risk? It's a lot to consider.
Wei Shui, I mean, you probably can address that best.
Yeah, so most mixture risk assessment is component based, meaning you add things up one at a time. Now there are some cases, for instance, diesel and particulate matter are technically mixtures, and they're considered as sort of a whole mixture. There is research going on, at NIHS and elsewhere to try to better understand how are we actually going to test mixtures. And, it's certainly impossible to test the variation of mixtures in animal studies. So I think there is interest in using in vitro methods to try to, look at what synergy or antagonism in a more rapid manner. And, potentially in the future, you can take samples from a particular incident and rapidly test those and see if you're getting sort of a whole mixture kind of screening of potential toxicity. But we aren't ready in terms of like field application of that type of technology yet.
I think it's important to highlight that we rarely have primary data or firsthand data testing different chemical mixtures in animals, and certainly not epidemiologic studies that do a really great job controlling those exposures for people for ethical reasons. But what we can do in risk assessment is we can look at the different health endpoints that are associated with exposure to different groups of chemicals, and we can try and group those chemicals by the targets in the body that they have in common. The limitation of that approach is that what we assume about those interactions is that they're additive, meaning we add the effects of different chemicals together. In reality, we don't usually have the information to know if when chemicals are present together, they may be synergistic and cause an effect above and beyond additivity, or if one chemical may cause the effect of another chemical to be less. It's generally unknown. So these limited approaches to considering cumulative risk are of value as a starting point for thinking about health outcomes that may occur as a result of exposure to a mixture, but we have a long way to go in terms of trying to quantify those cumulative burdens on people. I made a point during my talk about thinking through, is it really what we should be striving for to try and get the number perfect in light of all those data gaps and uncertainties? Or are there better risk management approaches where we can recognize the number of chemicals, the magnitude of the mixture itself, when we think about strategies to intervene, recognizing that there may be effects above and beyond what we'd add together when we think about chemicals and target organs? I don't know if anybody else
Yeah, and Dr. Williams noted in the chat that many of you probably can't see that he had a column there that showed that for the rapid tox, the third potential workflow is for mixtures. And he says it is complex and challenging, but we all are not naive to the needs for this research project. And there's just very little data associated with mixtures available.